The Origins of the American Revolution, Part 4. This is the fourth of 4 lectures on the origins of the American Revolution. Where we left off in Part 3 was that the American colonial resistance movement, led by the elite, had realized that they had psychological unity, moral outrage, they were being hit in the pocketbook by what they considered unfair taxes, and they were being treated like children by the British Empire and the British Parliament. All of this would lead to a climax, a series of events that would plunge the British American colonies into revolution. By mid-1768, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts was convinced nothing less than military force could solve the problem. Protests had continued. The Royal Customs Commissioners had even been forced to flee Boston. What was to be done? The British decided on a policy known as coercion, forcing the colonists to obey by the use or threat of force. But the resistance movement was not cowed, and the policy actually inflamed the situation. Great Britain built up its forces in Boston to crush protest if necessary. Boston turned ugly. There were continuous skirmishes between citizens and soldiers. It reached a head on March 5, 1770, with an event that came to be known as the Boston Massacre. In the Boston Common outside the Customs Commission office, there were daily protests, and a British sentry under attack by one of these protest groups called for aid. Soldiers arrived, scuffling occurred, and shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, 3 of the protesters were dead, including the person generally considered to be the first person to die at the Boston Massacre, a black man, either a free black man or a former slave named Crispus Attucks. 3 were dead, 2 more were dying and would soon die, and there were 6 wounded. As a result of this, 8 soldiers, 1 officer, and 4 civilians were charged with murder as a result of this event. They went on trial. The soldiers were defended by Massachusetts lawyer, revolutionary and future founding father John Adams. And in that trial, through the defense of John Adams, the soldiers were acquitted of murder, but 2 were convicted of manslaughter. Following the Boston Massacre, Great Britain realized its policy of coercion was wrong. They withdrew their troops, and they repealed all of the Townshend duties, except the most hated of the Townshend duties, which was the tax on tea. An uneasy calm returned, however, a relative peace. Then additional events started to happen. In 1772, Great Britain announced it would now directly pay the salaries of the royal governor and judges, taking away any control from the colonists. Also in 1772, there was an incident called the Gaspé Incident. The Gaspé was a British boat that looked for colonial contraband, such as smuggled tea. The Gaspé dropped anchor in the waters off of Rhode Island for repairs, and the Gaspé was boarded by angry colonists in Narragansett Bay near Rhode Island and burnt. Additional protests erupted, and by December 1773, after months of protest and tension, British ships carrying tea arrived in Boston Harbor. Following a public meeting led by Samuel Adams, the so-called Boston Tea Party occurred. Colonial protesters, many of them disguised as Native Americans, boarded the ships and destroyed 342 chests of tea, dumping the tea into the Boston Harbor and staining the Boston Harbor a tea color. The British tea was actually cheaper than smuggled tea, but the destruction of the British tea was a symbol of resistance and defiance. The Boston Tea Party was the last straw for Great Britain and the Parliament, and at this act of defiance, the British Parliament reacted oppressively. In 1774, the coercive acts were rushed through Parliament. These acts were called the Intolerable Acts by the colonial protesters. The coercive acts would force colonials to submit to Britain's will, effectively wiping out self-government in Massachusetts and closing the Boston port. The royal governor could appoint officials without legislative approval. The royal governor could appoint judges without legislative approval, and town meetings were forbidden except to elect officials who had no power. Parliament hoped to isolate Massachusetts and make it an example for other colonies. Virginia, which was the largest and most populous colony, declared support for Massachusetts, and they called for a Continental Congress. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met, and there the protesters drew up declarations of rights and grievances. It was not the Declaration of Independence, that came later. The British Parliament, upon hearing of the Continental Congress, ordered it to disband, but the Continental Congress refused. This was a truly revolutionary and dangerous act. Citizen armies, or colonial militias, in Massachusetts began drilling and preparing for conflict. Great Britain ordered the governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, to take the offensive against these Massachusetts troublemakers, now officially called traitors, and Gage is ordered to stop the training of the militia and to seize their arms and ammunition. On April 18, 1775, the British began to move westward toward the villages of Lexington and Concord, a hotbed of this militia movement led by groups that are known by such names as the Minutemen. On April 18th, as the British Army began to move westward toward Lexington and Concord, there were a number of individuals who rode toward Lexington and Concord to warn them that the British were on their way. One of them was one of the more famous and richer individuals in Boston, a gold and silversmith by the name of Paul Revere. Paul Revere becomes famous largely because of a poem that was written many years later, in the year 1863, right in the middle of the American Civil War. It was a poem written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called Paul Revere's Ride, and it cemented Paul Revere's involvement in warning Lexington and Concord. Here are a few passages from this famous poem. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm." A hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath, from the pebbles in passing, a spark, struck out by a steed flying fearless and fleet, that was all. And yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. For borne on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. The next day, on April 19, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord occurred. They were the first battles of the American Revolutionary War. The battles marked the outbreak of open-armed conflict between Great Britain and its 13 colonies on the mainland of British North America. In these battles, about 800 British Army regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith were ordered to capture military supplies that were reportedly stored by the Massachusetts militia at Concord. The Patriot colonists had received intelligence weeks before the expedition, which warned of an impending British search. At this, the colonists moved nearly all the supplies to safety. They had also received details about British plans on the night before from individuals like Paul Revere, and the information was rapidly supplied to the militia. The first shots were fired in a skirmish at Lexington during the British Army's advance. The militia were outnumbered and fled. Other Patriot soldiers at the North Bridge in Concord fought 3 companies of the King's troops. The British Army broke ranks and fled from the Minutemen after a pitched battle in open territory. More Minutemen arrived in the following hours and inflicted heavy damage on the British regular army, returning from Concord. This combined force of about 1,900 marched back to Boston under heavy fire in a successful tactical withdrawal and eventually reached the safety of Charlestown. The British failed to maintain the secrecy and speed required to conduct a successful strike into hostile territory, and they seized no weapons of significance. Most British regulars returned to Boston unharmed. The occupation of surrounding areas by the Massachusetts militia that evening marked the beginning of what was called the Siege of Boston. The battles of Lexington and Concord became known as the shots heard round the world, thanks to a famous poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson entitled The Concord Hymn. The casualty figures for the battles of Lexington and Concord were significant. For the American resistance movement, there were 94 killed and wounded, and for the British, there were 275 killed and wounded. With these battles, the American Revolutionary War began.